Welcome to the mini paint adventure. Today we're going to learn how to slap chop. Slap chop is when you're going to use a gradient effect on a model and then go over it with a contrasting color. I'm starting out with Administratum Gray. It's really important to know how to load your brush. So here you can see me just dabbing it into the model, and then I'm going to wipe it off on a tissue paper. It's important to use a tissue paper and not a paper towel. You don't want to over absorb the liquid and then you'll get a dusty effect, and you also don't want any fibers getting into your paint onto the brush. I'm using a Korgoroth here from the Blades of Corn Gore-Tide set. It's a perfect model for this. Here I'm just testing it on my hand to make sure that I have enough onto the brush that, well, I'll have an effect, but not so much that I would just slather it on. And you're just going to press lightly as you dryly brush over the model. You're going to allow the brush to just find its way onto the different surfaces, just avoiding the super deep recesses and going a little bit heavier over the higher areas. After we've done that, we're going to move on to a lighter shade. I'm using Corax White. It's a little bit of an off-white, so it has a bit of a higher level of brightness to it, but it's not going to be a pure white. This is great for some of those higher areas, just a little bit more built up to just try and get that color to be really punchy. Focusing in on those edges and those higher portions, that way they'll stand out against the darker recessed areas like under the arms or underneath the model. Last step for the dry brushing portion, and that's going to be using a pure white. This time I'm using White Scar. I'm focusing on those very fine points, the highest parts of the model, the very tips and corners, just so that way when the contrasting paint goes over it, that will have a brighter effect, and that way it'll just kind of have a really nice natural gradient of color, going from a super bright red down to a kind of a very dark, very kind of a grim red at the very low end of the spectrum. Also putting a little bit of extra help over the bone, just because there's a need for a little bit more brightness. Time to slap on some color here. I'm using Blood Angels Red. You could use Flesh Terrors Red or another red contrast paint here, but I just had Blood Angels Red on me, so it worked really well. Just making sure that we're going over nice and even. Don't overload your brush here, because you want to make sure that you can go evenly over the surface but not have to pass over it again, because that can disturb the paint while it's drying. We're just going or working our way across the model. This works really well on these organic surfaces like muscle or fur or bone. You might want to stay away from flat panels with this technique, but it can be done just a lot more carefully. You just have to make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush. Now we're moving on to the bone sections. I do have to apologize for the angle here, because I had to be able to see the edge as I'm painting away from it. This is like the technique that you learn as a kid when you're drawing into a coloring book. You always draw away from the line. That way you can just kind of establish that border, and then you can start filling in the area afterwards. I'm using Skeleton Horde here just because it's a really nice bone effect. It gives a really aged and browned out look, but it still retains a lot of that kind of an off-white, kind of a yellow-white on those higher areas. I'm going to use it over the bones and on the spikes and horns. Now for those meatier bits, I'm using Sigvald Burgundy just to break up the red a little bit. So I'm going to focus in on these tentacle hands that he has, but later on I'll also cover in the kind of the tendon areas or kind of just odd sections, just so that it's not a pure red all over the model. You could go in with something a little bit pinker or just a completely different color if you wanted to, but I just wanted to do this one. This would also be a good one to come in afterwards and just add some extra highlights in another color, like a light pink, just to kind of break up the texture of the model and the kind of the effect on that little piece, just draw some more interest to it. Now it's time to get metal. I'm going to use Balthazar Gold. It's one of my favorite golds. It has a really nice coverage and can go really well over these kind of whites and gray shades. Usually can go on with one coat, but if you really do feel like you need to, just keep it thin and do a second coat right over the same areas. Now we're going to work our way from one panel to the next all over the model, just making sure that we have nice thin coats If you have to, like I said, wait for them to fully dry and then move on to the next layer. Once this is done, you could pop in a shade over it just to kind of give it some extra effect if you wanted to. Last block of color here, we're going to use Black Templar Black. I like this black for this method just because it will allow a lot of the highlights to show through. We're going to cover in the hooves and the claws on the feet just to make it look like those claws are something separate from the bone itself. This is one of my favorite things to do with my models when I'm coloring in. You see a lot of metallic gold, a lot of metallic silver and bronze, but you don't see a whole lot of colored metallics. And since this technique is similar to the Slapchop method, I just wanted to throw that in here as a little bit of an extra today. I'm blocking in Blood Angel's Red directly over some of the flat panels of Balthazar Gold. Balthazar Gold really works well for this, along with that Blood Angel's Red, just to give a really metallic red effect. There's a lot of fun ways you can slap color into your metallics and just make them stand out against other armies. You could use something like Warpstone Green or Leviathan Blue, and you can have a really different metal look from any of your other heavy metal armies like Stormcast Eternals or things like that, just by adding a little bit of color. The same way with the body, though, you want to make sure that you just have a slight amount of the paint on the brush at a time, go over it in one pass, and don't disturb it while it dries. And this is the end result. You have some really nice gradient effects from the highest points in the edges all the way into those deep recesses. Just have a really nice natural look with only about 30 to 45 minutes worth of work. I really recommend this metal for models like this. Blood for the Blood God!